The story begins with Absalom's sister Tamar. She was beautiful and virtuous, but her life was shattered when their half-brother Amnon lusted after her. Consumed by his desires, Amnon deceived Tamar by pretending to be ill and tricked her into visiting his chamber. There he violated her, then cruelly cast her out in disgrace. Tamar, devastated and shamed, fled to Absalom, who took her into his home. Although enraged, Absalom kept his feelings hidden, biding his time for revenge. King David, upon hearing of the incident, was furious but failed to punish Amnon. This inaction only fueled Absalom's bitterness. 2 years passed, but Absalom's hatred for Amnon burned fiercely. He invited all of David's sons to a grand sheep-shearing festival. With meticulous planning, Absalom ordered his servants to strike Amnon down when he was drunk. They carried out the plan, and Amnon was murdered. In the aftermath, panic ensued among David's sons, and they fled. David was heartbroken, mourning both the loss of Amnon and the estrangement of Absalom, who escaped to his maternal grandfather in Geshur. For 3 years, Absalom lived in exile, yearning to return home while David longed for reconciliation. Eventually, Joab, David's loyal commander, orchestrated Absalom's return. Using a wise woman from Tekoa, Joab presented a parable to David, convincing him to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. In the parable, the woman claimed to be a widow with 2 sons. She explained that one son killed the other during a quarrel, and now the rest of the family demanded that the surviving son be put to death as retribution. This would leave her without an heir, devastating her family and inheritance. The woman appealed to David for mercy on behalf of her surviving son, framing her plea as a parallel to David's situation with Absalom. When David expressed his willingness to protect the son in the story, the woman revealed that her parable was meant to prompt him to act similarly toward Absalom, who had been estranged but was still his son. David recognized Joab's influence behind the woman's story, but ultimately agreed to allow Absalom to return to Jerusalem, though their relationship remained strained. However, David imposed a condition. Absalom could return, but he was not allowed to see the king's face. For 2 years, Absalom lived in Jerusalem without seeing his father. Absalom became increasingly frustrated by David's refusal to grant him an audience, as it left his status unresolved. Despite living in Jerusalem, he was effectively cut off from royal privileges and influence. Absalom sought Joab's help to arrange a meeting with King David, but Joab ignored his repeated requests. To get Joab's attention, Absalom ordered his servants to set Joab's barley field on fire. This act of destruction forced Joab to confront Absalom. When Joab finally met Absalom, Absalom demanded to see the king, expressing his desire for resolution. If David still saw him as guilty, he was willing to accept punishment, even death. Joab relayed Absalom's message to David, who finally summoned Absalom. David forgave him. David kissed his son, seemingly mending the fractured relationship. But beneath the surface, resentment and ambition festered. Absalom, ever the charmer, began to conspire against his father. He stationed himself at the city gate, intercepting those who sought justice from King David. He would ask about their concerns and lament the lack of attention they were receiving from the king, saying, "Your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel and amassed a loyal following. After 4 years, Absalom made his move. He asked David for permission to go to Hebron under the guise of fulfilling a vow to God. Absalom told King David that he had made a vow to God while he was in Geshur, saying that if the Lord brought him back to Jerusalem, he would go to Hebron to fulfill the vow by offering sacrifices. David agreed, unaware of the rebellion brewing. In Hebron, Absalom declared himself king, and his followers rallied around him. News of the rebellion reached David, who fled Jerusalem with his loyal servants and household to avoid bloodshed. David's escape from Jerusalem was marked by sorrow and humiliation. Loyalists, including Zadok the priest, offered to bring the Ark of the Covenant, but David insisted it remain in the city, trusting God's will. Along the way, David encountered Shimei, a relative of Saul, who cursed and pelted him with stones. Despite the insult, David forbade retaliation, believing that Shimei's actions might be God's judgment. Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem and consolidated power. Advised by Ahithophel, a cunning counselor who was David's trusted counselor, who chose Absalom's side, Absalom sought to establish his authority. Ahithophel suggested publicly taking David's concubines, a move that symbolized Absalom's claim to the throne and humiliated his father. David, now in exile, organized his forces. Hushai, a loyal friend, infiltrated Absalom's court as a double agent. While Ahithophel advised a swift attack to crush David's weakened forces, Hushai counseled caution, playing on Absalom's vanity. Absalom followed Hushai's advice, giving David precious time to regroup. The armies of King David and Absalom clashed in the forest of Ephraim. David's forces, led by Joab and other commanders, gained the upper hand. Despite being vastly outnumbered, David's men inflicted heavy losses on Absalom's army, and the dense forest claimed even more lives. Before the battle, David had strictly instructed his commanders to deal gently with Absalom, saying, "For my sake, protect the young man Absalom." As Absalom fled the battlefield on a mule, his long, thick hair became entangled in the branches of a large oak tree. The mule kept running, leaving Absalom hanging in midair, vulnerable and helpless. One of David's soldiers spotted Absalom and reported it to Joab, David's commander. The soldier refused to harm Absalom, citing David's explicit order to protect him. However, Joab, angered and impatient, dismissed the king's command. Joab took 3 javelins and thrust them into Absalom's heart, while he was still hanging alive in the tree. Afterward, 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and struck him until he died. Joab blew the trumpet to signal the end of the battle, and his men stopped pursuing the fleeing Israelites. They took Absalom's body, threw it into a deep pit in the forest, and covered it with a large heap of stones. This unceremonious burial reflected the dishonor of his rebellion. When David received the news of Absalom's death, he was overcome with grief. He cried out, "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom! My son! My son!" His intense mourning caused concern among his troops, as they felt their victory was overshadowed by the king's sorrow. Joab, David's commander, became deeply concerned about the morale of the troops. The soldiers, who had fought bravely to secure victory against Absalom's rebellion, returned to the city feeling ashamed rather than celebrated. Joab confronted David, chastising him for putting his personal grief above the loyalty and sacrifices of his men. Joab rebuked David, saying, "Today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead." Joab urged David to go out and encourage his troops, warning him that if he did not,
his army might abandon him entirely. Realizing the truth in Joab's words, David set aside his grief and appeared before his men at the city gate, where he thanked them for their loyalty and efforts. Meanwhile, the people of Israel, who had supported Absalom, were left leaderless and uncertain about their future.